So let's take a look at the MacBook Pro mid 2014 and try to answer the question, should you still buy this laptop today? And is this laptop still usable today? Well, here it is in all of its fine glory. And before I talk about the specs, I will be talking about everything else. If you want to know the specs of this, I will show you the specs of this thing when I actually turn on the computer and go into settings. So stay tuned for that. But let's first talk about the design of this thing. When it comes to the design of the mid 2014 MacBook Pro, I must say this thing aged extremely well, and I'm pretty sure most people who use this computer today won't complain about the design. I really do feel like the design of this thing does look like a modern day MacBook. If you were to buy a MacBook today, a lot of the MacBooks look exactly the same as this. So it's kind of like, yeah, this thing aged extremely well. It doesn't really feel like a laptop that did come out of 2014. Now there is one thing to note about this laptop, and that definitely has to be that this thing does use the older design, and since it is using the older design, you do actually get that Apple logo that does glow on the back through the casing, and that could be a good or bad thing depending on who you ask. But honestly, it doesn't matter, since when you use the computer you're not going to see that glowing Apple logo anyway, but it is what it is. So when it comes to the looks departments and aesthetics of this thing aged extremely well in my opinion. And let's talk about some things this laptop does better than a lot of the newer MacBooks. First and foremost, the biggest thing this has over some of the newer MacBooks definitely has to be the fact that this thing has ports galore. This was a time when Apple really went very hard on adding as many ports as possible to their laptops, and this one is no exception to the rule. This one has a lot of ports, and let's go over all the ports that are currently on here. First and foremost, you do get two Thunderbolt ports on here. You do get two USB ports, and those are standard USB-A ports. And then you do get a headphone jack. Believe it or not, you do get an HDMI port, which is nice to have. And then you also get an SD card slot on the side of it, and that's going to be nice, obviously, if you do take a lot of photos and videos with a standard camera, so that's nice. The one thing that is very controversial on this laptop definitely has to be the fact that this thing does use the much more older MagSafe charging. On one hand, it's kind of a downside because you do have to bring a specific cable around with you if you want to use the laptop. But on another hand, you don't have to worry about damaging your laptop, because if it's on a table by any stretch of the imagination, when you pull it off, you don't have to worry about it falling off a table, because the charger is pretty much connected to the MacBook with magnets. So anytime someone pulls the cord away from the laptop, it will automatically just disconnect from the laptop, saving your laptop from falling off a table. So that's something that I do actually like about this laptop. And then another nice benefit of this laptop definitely has to be the fact that this laptop at this very moment is actually up to date, and it is running the latest and greatest from Apple when it comes to the latest Mac OS release. It's actually running Mac OS Big Sur. Granted, the one that you're looking at right in front of you unfortunately isn't on Big Sur. It's actually on the older Catalina, but if you did want the latest and greatest OS from Apple, you do have it with Big Sur here. And I'm actually really happy that Apple really does treat their customers well, and they really go above and beyond when it comes to updating a lot of their older products. So yes, this one again is running the latest and greatest from Apple. If you want to install it, again, this one is on Catalina. Now let's actually go ahead and open the laptop and talk a little bit more about this laptop. First and foremost, let's actually go over the keyboard. Now this is something I really do like about this laptop. This laptop is using the older keyboards from Apple, but that's actually a good thing, because I think in 2016, 2017, or 2018, Apple did change their keyboards because they wanted to make their laptops as thin as possible. And since they wanted to make their laptops as thin as possible, they decided to go with those scissors, or those butterfly keys, I do believe. And I think those butterfly switches, I do believe, are the ones that actually broke down. They weren't reliable. They didn't feel nice to type on. Overall, they just weren't great keyboards, and I understand why they used them. They used them again because they wanted to make their laptops as thin as possible, but then it meant the reliability and the greatness of the keyboard went down. So with this laptop, you won't have anything to worry about since it does use the older MacBook keyboards, which I actually think with the later MacBooks, they decided to go back to this keyboard, and this was the great keyboard from Apple. So the keyboard is very satisfying to type on. It has good key travel. It's very reliable. I've had no issues with this keyboard. I actually really do love this keyboard. It also has a backlight on the keyboard as well, which is very nice. If I can turn on the backlight. Yes, it has a backlight. You can't really see it because it's pretty bright in here, but it does have a backlight. And then when it comes to the trackpad, I would say Apple does make some pretty nice trackpads. It doesn't have the latest trackpad with all the nicer things, but it is a pretty nice trackpad to actually use. Of course, it has all the gestures for the swiping, pinch to zoom, and all that stuff. But it is really nice to type on, really nice to use the touchpad. And the nicest thing about this touchpad is also the fact that it is very big. So if you have big hands, you shouldn't really have any problems using that touchpad. And then it does have speakers on the side, and I would say the speakers aren't bad, but they're not amazing. They're somewhere in between for me, at least if I compare them to other products I do currently use and currently own. But they are some pretty nice speakers. Just expect it to be kind of a mixed bag depending on what you're listening to, depending on what you're doing. It is going to be a mixed bag. Now let's actually go up to the display, and here is the display. Right here, you will see it does have a bezel around the screen, but I wouldn't say the bezel is too thick or too distracting. And a lot of modern day devices still have a bezel, and I've even seen worse bezels on displays, believe it or not. So this bezel on this display is actually pretty okay. And I think most people won't have a problem with the bezel around the screen when it comes to this MacBook. Now let's actually go into settings and go into about this Mac, and then let's go ahead and talk about the specs of the one that you're currently seeing on camera. First and foremost, like I said, this thing is running Mac OS Catalina. It's not running Mac OS Big Sur. So everything that you're going to see in this video when it comes to performance is going to be based off of Catalina. And then for the MacBook, you can see it is a MacBook Pro. It is a Retina display, and I will say this display aged beautiful. There's no problem with this display. It's very vibrant. It's very crisp. It's very clean. Overall, it looks amazing, I would actually say, and for today's standards, it aged extremely well. And the nice thing about this MacBook is the fact that I think it has over a 1080p display, so you won't have any problems in the display department, whether you're watching YouTube videos, whether you're watching Netflix, whether you're watching just any videos on the internet. This thing looks amazing, honestly, even for today's standards. It is a 15-inch model. It is a mid-2014, like I said. And then for the processor, it is running a 2.2 gigahertz quad-core Intel i7. And then for the memory, we are using 16 gig of RAM at 1600 megahertz, and it is DDR3 RAM. And then for the graphics, it is running an Intel Iris Pro 1536 megabyte graphics card, but the graphics card on here is pretty bad. Honestly, you're not going to be playing any games on here. You're not going to be doing anything intensive when it comes to the graphics department, because this thing just absolutely sucks when it comes to the graphics. But hey, most MacBooks aren't really meant to game in general, so just keep your expectations pretty low. This one is pretty much unusable when it comes to gaming in general, so you can just pretty much forget about it. But let's go ahead into the web browser and load up a web page. I'm going to go ahead and go into, I guess, Engadget, and you can kind of see how fast this thing loads up. Now, when it comes to Wi-Fi speeds, this isn't running the latest and greatest. It's actually running the older Wi-Fi N, I do actually believe. And Wi-Fi N isn't necessarily bad, considering it can handle pretty fast speeds. It's not like it's running anything older. I would say N is still a very good speed when it comes to Wi-Fi cards. Sure, it's not the latest and greatest. It's not Wi-Fi 6. It's not Wi-Fi AC or anything crazy, but it is what it is, and I think for most people you'll be okay. But let's load up Engadget and see how fast this thing actually loads. You can see it pretty much loaded in about 1 second, so there's really no problem there. And then when you scroll up and down the pages, you can see it flies through web pages. It's very fast. It's very responsive. It's not laggy. It pretty much feels like the day it came out of the box, to be honest. If you did buy this on day one, I've had no problems with performance, and I'm pretty sure most people out here aren't going to have any problems with performance or the screen or anything like that. I did forget to mention two other things. This has 256 gigs of built-in storage, which doesn't really matter, but then it also does have an SSD, so keep that in mind about the snappiness of this computer. Again, it is running an SSD instead of a hard drive, but yeah, you can see it just flies through web pages. Let's go ahead and open up some more web pages to see how much stuff you can actually have loaded before it bogs down. But you can see so far it's still pretty much holding up extremely well when it comes to the performance. You can see it's still pretty much flying through all these web pages. Granted, I only have two web pages open, which isn't really saying much considering that this thing does have 16 gig of RAM and it is DDR3 RAM, and DDR3 RAM is still very good RAM. You can see it is still holding up very well with only 3 tabs open. Let's go ahead and open up something like, I guess, maybe ESPN. Yep, you can see it's still holding up extremely well, but tabs shouldn't really eat too much memory or anything crazy like that. But you can see when it comes to performance, when it comes to switching different tabs in Safari, when it comes to web browsing, this thing is running extremely well. Again, keep in mind everything that I'm doing on here is based off of macOS Catalina and not the newer macOS Big Sur. So if you do buy this laptop and you do go ahead and install this with macOS Big Sur, I don't necessarily know how the performance is going to hold up. Is it going to hold up really good with this older hardware, or is going to start bogging down with this older hardware? I would assume Apple knows what they're doing and has everything down to a science to where this thing would still be stable and still perform pretty good. Now, is this thing going to be as fast as something like a newer MacBook from Apple? Obviously not, of course, but if you're just doing things like light web browsing, watching videos all day and things like that, that's where this thing really does do extremely well. And honestly, even though this is from 2014, myself personally have done a lot of things like video edit on here, and I can tell you this thing still does extremely well when it comes to video editing. Depending on what you're doing, of course, I wouldn't recommend obviously editing like a 4K video clip on here and having like a big stream of things. That's probably where this thing I can potentially see bogging down, since back in 2014 4K content really wasn't a thing, and this thing really wasn't made around being able to edit 4K content. So if you're going to be editing 4K content or anything crazy like that, I would honestly probably say stay away from this. But for light video editing, maybe 1080p clips and things like that, I think you'll be okay with this thing. And when it comes to the day-to-day noise this thing puts out, at least for mine specifically, I've had no problems with it. It's a really nice experience. I will say it doesn't really heat up as much as well, and the noise isn't bad at all. It will get kind of noisy if I do things like heavy video edit and things like that. That's where I really start to see this thing start to really push out a lot of sound and a lot of heat from the fan and things like that. But for the most part, just doing simple tasks like web browsing and things like that, I really don't have any problem with the performance of this thing. Let's go ahead and actually open up a couple of different programs to see how this thing actually holds up in the long run. Let's just go ahead and load up something like Finder, I guess. And here is Finder right here. You can see I'm moving it around the screen. I also have Safari open, moving it around the screen. Let's go ahead and open up System Preferences. Here's System Preferences. You can see for the most part, performance is extremely good on this thing, and I've had no problems. Speaking on battery, the battery, of course, is going to be a mixed bag for a lot of people, considering this thing is very old. Now, I can tell you right away, this thing hasn't really been used that much, to be honest, and the battery is still holding up extremely well on this thing. I'm easily to get about 6 to 7 hours of usage out of this thing, believe it or not. and that's just incredible. But of course, if you get one that someone used a lot of course the battery's going to be in worse condition. The nice thing with these laptops is the fact that when it comes to battery, you do not have to worry about ever changing the battery, because if the battery ever dies, you can actually just use it on the wall with your MacBook Pro charger forever until the computer actually craps out, like the SSD craps out, the CPU dies, the screen dies, and things like that. However, there is something nice about this laptop. Some of the parts in here are actually upgradable and replaceable as well. Like for instance, the battery on here can be replaced, and they do sell new batteries for this thing. Just keep in mind the batteries on this thing are kind of expensive for what they are. I'm seeing over $100 for the batteries. Your mileage may vary. It may be cheaper than $100. It may be over $100, but from what I'm seeing, the batteries were over $100, so they are kind of expensive for what they are. I think you can upgrade the RAM. I don't think I can, because this is a 16 gig model, but I think the RAM is upgradable. If it's not the RAM, it's definitely, I think, the SSD. I'm pretty sure the SSD can be changed. Maybe not the RAM, but it's one of the two. But I think it's the SSD, excuse me, it's the SSD that can be changed, and I don't think the RAM, but it's the SSD and the battery that can be changed. And that's actually pretty nice, because a lot of the newer MacBooks you can't upgrade or replace parts, and it's nice with this one. This one is very easy to repair and very easy to replace some of the parts, like the SSD and the battery, if they ever do go kaput. So the final verdict on this thing, should you buy this today? Yes, I would definitely say buy this thing if you can get one in good condition and no one has really damaged it and everything like that. This thing has held up extremely well for me. Taking consideration, again, I am running Catalina. I have to make that as clear as day, just so you know that this is Catalina again, because I don't know how this would actually perform on something like macOS Big Sur. Maybe in the near future I will do a video of installing macOS Big Sur on here and then testing out macOS Big Sur on the MacBook Pro mid 2014 edition. Also keep a note, I do believe there is two different versions of this, a Retina model and a non-Retina model. So if you want the best screen during the mid 2014 MacBooks, I would definitely say get the Retina, because at this point in time, this thing is so old that the Retina MacBook Pro mid 2014 is not too expensive, depending on where you look, depending on the condition of it and things like that. I would just pull the trigger on the mid 2014 Retina. But honestly, at this point, maybe it's also not a good idea to buy the mid 2014 MacBook Pro, just due to the fact that you could end up getting a 2015 model a little bit for a little bit more money, and maybe at that point it's kind of like just pull the trigger on that one. But again, the nicest thing with this one that you would be missing on newer MacBooks would be all those ports. So it's kind of like, even though this is a much more older MacBook, it's kind of cool that you would be buying this thing, and technically you would be getting a lot of advantages that the newer MacBooks don't even have. So many ports, MagSafe, depending on if you like it or not like it. But really, the port situation is what you'd be buying this laptop for, because I will admit, not having to worry about bringing around a dongle all the time is actually a really nice thing, especially if you are a person that's not going to be using this as like a desktop computer and leaving it in one place, especially if you are going to be traveling. I did forget to mention, I do have to make this clear, I did forget to mention before I head out of here, one downside of this MacBook, and I want to make this clear. The biggest downside to this, which isn't really a big downside, but depending on who you ask and depending on how you use your laptop, this may be a downside. This thing is relatively heavy, even for today's standards, and for most devices, I would say this thing could be a make it or break it in your decision on buying this thing. The thing is with this MacBook Pro is the fact that this thing is relatively heavy. It comes in at 4 pounds, and 4 pounds may not seem that heavy, but if you compare it to other laptops on the market today, 4 pounds is relatively heavy. It's on the upper end of being a little bit too heavy, and when I move this thing around, I can definitely tell you this thing does feel kind of like a brick, whether it's in my backpack, whether I'm just holding it in my hands to transport it somewhere. This thing is relatively heavy, and that's really the only downside I can see with this thing. I'm just not really a fan of how heavy this thing is to begin with, so that's something you do have to take in consideration. And depending on how you use it, do you leave it on a desk or do you travel around a lot, like put it in a backpack or hand hold it to move it around to different spots in like your room, or just travel around. And yeah, this thing can add up, especially when you know when you travel, you're not just going to bring the MacBook alone, you're going to bring other things on your adventures and your trips, and that 4 pounds will make a very big difference, especially when you add up everything in like a backpack, to just take that into consideration. But overall, this MacBook is still extremely well. I would recommend it. It performs extremely well. Just know what you want to get out of your laptop as well. Of course, it doesn't have the best performance in the world compared to some other newer MacBooks, but I think for what it is, it's still a very good laptop. Anyway, guys, this is Wayne from My Tech News, signing out.